Okay, welcome everybody to this Bocchiaro video tutorial. So we are looking at disobedience and whistleblowing. Remember, the key theme throughout the social area is the response to people in authority, and it's paired with Milgram as the AS study. So let's have a look as we go through. Just pause, complete any associated tasks you've got in your workbooks, and complete a summary. Whenever you see the pause sign, just pause the video, and it really is important that you summarize all of the key terms of the key elements of the study. Do it in a creative way, do it in whatever way you want: PowerPoint, Prezi, audio recording, anything you want, but make sure that you're doing that, cue cards, whatever it is. Okay, so here we go. Theoretical background. This is Bocchiaro here, seen in Bocchiaro is in Italian. You can see the Italian landscape there. I don't know who this is, but this is Zimbardo. There's a picture online that I found. Zimbardo, as you remember from the introduction to the approach, conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment and is a major player in the social area of psychology. Bocchiaro is working with him on this piece of research, and another researcher as well, who I can't remember the name. Lang at Amsterdam University. So even though these two don't work at Amsterdam University, the research is being conducted at Amsterdam University with Lang, who works there. Okay, so here we go. Key term: social power. What is social power? It is a term that we use to refer to the influence an individual has to change another's thoughts, feelings, or behaviours. Legitimate or illegitimate figures of authority have social power to influence those within their social hierarchy. Okay, so you can have legitimate social power. You can actually be a legitimate authority figure, or you could be an illegitimate figure of authority and just be someone who rules the roost kind of thing in your social group. So you're not actually an authority figure by occupation, for example. So there's a kind of societal look from a capitalist, this is a Marxist perspective of capitalism, really, but the royalty has influence on the religion has influence on the army has an influence on the politicians, and that, or the middle classes, the upper classes, and then the working class are at the bottom. So each has their own social power on another. Now, what do we mean by independent behaviour, defiance, and whistleblowing? So independent behaviour is somebody's individuality, so your ability to behave as you want. Okay, defiance is says here, precondition of social progress. Now, if you want society to progress, if you want democracy, for example, to take over in a country where there hasn't been democracy before, for example in China, you need individuals to be disobedient. They need to defy what the governing powers are arguing to get to a state of democracy. So this was a famous incident in 1989 in Tiananmen Square in China, where there was lots of protests going on against the ruling powers in China, and this man, known as Tank Man, got out there just with his shopping bags. He's on his way home and decides, no, I'm going to make a stand, and stood in front of this tank. And this tank tried to drive around him, and he moved in front of the tank again. And so he's been defiant to the social hierarchy that exists. He's being disobedient. Incidentally, we don't know what happened to him. He was put in a van and taken away, and we don't actually know what happened to him. But there we go. It was a great statement that was seen across the world as defiance and disobedience being a positive thing to try and create social progress, to try and get social change. A whistleblower is someone who exposes or informs on a person or an organisation. Okay, and there's a difference between a defiant or a disobedient person and a whistleblower, because a defiant person's less likely to continue on to be a whistleblower. The boss can tell you to do something, and you can be defiant and secretly not do it. But whether you report your boss as being incompetent to their boss is a completely different thing, because you have to confront your boss at some point about it. It's your word against theirs. So yeah, there is a difference between whether you're going to be a whistleblower from a defiant person. The whistleblowing takes a lot more strength really than simple disobedience. So individual personality variables, this is the individual versus situational, or dispositional versus situational debate. This different situations can impact how we react, but an individual's characteristics, for example, if you're the most honest person that there is, the most pro-social, so you're not anti-social, you're more likely to be defiant or disobedient and say, no, I disagree with what the rest of you are about to do. But different situations are going to affect whether you do step forward. If someone's pointing a gun at everybody's head, then you might be less likely to step forward. So what we say we would do and what we would do in a situation are very different. And this research finds that people predict that they would act very morally and ethically, but in fact, when you put them in the situation, they don't. Real life examples of that. This was in Vienna when the Nazis invaded Austria. Capital of Austria is Vienna, and they used these public displays of humiliation. So getting Jewish people to scrub the streets, for example. Everybody else is stood around. What would you have done? Would you have stepped forward in front of the Nazi officers and said, I think this is wrong? Because you probably would have been made to get down there with them as well. Or would you have laughed along, as some people did? And was that just a case of, that was the Nazi supporters? Well, no, because in France, this was through Paris towards the end of the Second World War, where the Nazis had moved into Paris but then had been pushed back out again. And these women were highlighted by the French as being Nazi sympathisers. They had been helping the Nazis out in Paris, probably just to survive, I expect, but they'd been helping them out, and so they were made to walk through the streets and were branded with the swastika on their faces. And you can see that their fellow French comrades are all laughing at them. And so it can happen both ways. So yeah, what would you have done? Would you have stepped forward and said, yeah, they helped the Nazis out, but we should forgive them? It's wrong, they were just doing their own thing. So there we go. Does the situation impact our behaviour, or is it our individual characteristic that sets us forward? So the background of the study. Milgram. The other core study, which I'm sure you've already done, is by Milgram, showed the strong inclinations that we have to obey, but there was little understanding about the nature of disobedience to unjust authority within it. For example, who are the people who disobey or blow the whistle? So Milgram's study is all about going along with the powers that be, but what about those who stood up to, so the 35% in Milgram's study, who stood up to the authority figure? Who are these people who disobey, and who are the people who blow the whistle? Who reports them to a higher authority? Who do they choose? Why do they choose the challenging moral path, these whistleblowers? And do their personality characteristics make them any different? So that's what the current study is looking at, these three questions. Do they have some personality traits about them? Why do they disobey? And what makes them blow the whistle if they go on to blow the whistle? So the current study aims were along those lines. So they used a Milgram paradigm, so authority requesting immoral acts, but gave participants to obey, to disobey, and also to whistleblow in this current study. They wanted to investigate whether that personality and the situational factors affected the participants. So was it the values of their personality that affected them more than the situation? Also, like Milgram, they wanted to show the difference in people's predictions of their own behaviour and others. So like Milgram asked the fellow professionals and the postgrad students to predict how many people would obey, Bocchiaro also does. Bocchiaro et al. Also does. What's the difference between what people predict they'll do and what the actual behavioural outcome is? In other words, what they actually do. So, Bocchiaro can be considered as a lab experiment. And Bocchiaro describe it as a lab experiment, but really, like Milgram, there's no independent variable, so really it's a you can describe it as a lab study, or Bocchiaro say a scenario study. Okay, the study took place in a lab at the VU University in Amsterdam, and conditions could be controlled. The procedure was standardized, so the experimental authority behavior and cover story were consistent throughout the experimental period, so everything was the same for every participant. 2 specially prepared rooms were used, and timings for when the experimenter left the room were kept the same for all participants, so everything is absolutely standardized. Data was gathered on the number of participants who obeyed by a written statement in support to a sensory deprivation study. I'll explain what that means a little bit later. Those who disobeyed by refusing to do what they were asked, and those who whistle blew. So the whistleblowers would report the experiment. They would have the opportunity to report the experiment as questionable conduct to the research committee. Okay, so they're measuring whether they whistleblow, whether they obey, or whether they disobey. And they're also measuring lots of different personality characteristics using some personality inventories. That means questionnaires. Okay, so it's a 60-item Hexaco PIR, and you can have a go at that online. You can find that. I'll show you an example of it later. So it measured 6 major dimensions of personality, a 9-item decomposed games measure. This measured social value orientation. So we're measuring social values, okay? Things like how religious you are, things out how moral you are, okay? Those kind of personality characteristics that might impact your obedience, disobedience, or whistleblowing. So they used 130 comparison students from the VU University and were provided with a detailed description of the experimental setting. They were asked, what would you do? So they're asking, this isn't the main study, this is a pilot study. They're asking students to predict what they would do, and what would the average student at your university do. So you're allowed people to judge what they think others would do. So the sample details for the actual study, they're using 149 undergrad students. Okay, so they're people in their first 3 years at university. 96 women, 53 men, mean age of 20.8, standard deviation of 2.65, so they're all pretty much around the 20-year-old mark. And they took part in research in exchange for either €7 or course credit. Okay, you always want to remember those because it can be important for evaluation whether paying them might have made a difference. Participants were recruited by flyers posted in the campus cafeterias of the VU University in Amsterdam. Okay, so the procedure details. Pilot tests, first of all, the 8 pilot tests involving 92 students were conducted to ensure the procedure was credible and morally acceptable. These tests also served to standardise the experimental authority behaviour through the experimental period. So they essentially practiced the research. They wanted to check that it was acceptable, that it wasn't too unethical, and they did that as a trial in 8 pilot tests. The comparison group was provided with a detailed description of the experimental settings and were asked, what would you do? So that's as mentioned just earlier, what would you do, and what would the average student at the university do? Okay. The main study then. I think we'll pause here, we'll go to video 2. So if you pause me now and summarise everything that we've talked about so far, okay, add that to your notes, and we'll start with the main study.